Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this last meeting of Nottingham Astronomical Society for this year. I hope everybody's doing well. Just a few quick announcements before we get into the main event, which will be fabulous. We have an AGM coming up in March, which will be held on Zoom. I'd like to encourage as many of you as possible to attend that so that we can actually get some things passed through there. Then we've got a great program coming up next year, including our first proper meeting, which will be in February, the 4th of February, I believe, is Jim Al-Khalili. So quite famous for being on TV and radio and lots of other things. So that's what's coming up. But now to tonight's event, which we are very pleased to announce that we have Mary McIntyre, who will be giving us a fabulous talk on sketching things. She is quite a well-known amateur astronomer, photographer, author, sketcher, very creative. In fact, there's almost nothing it seems she can't turn her hand to. And I have to say, having heard her talk on this subject a few times, it's very much, to me, like listening to Damien Peach. You come away thinking, yes, I could do all that. And it's so easy. But then you set yourself down to it and it's not quite as easy. But anyway, I'm sure she will show you how to go about these techniques in wonderful detail. Do please remember to join us afterwards for a Zoom meetup where we'll all have perhaps a mince pie and a hearty drink or something, and perhaps Mary will answer a few questions live there before she has to go. Other than that, over to you, Mary, and thank you very much for doing this for us.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me to speak to you for the first time at your Christmas meeting. That's awesome. I'll just share my screen and we can go on to my presentation. So tonight I'm going to talk through lots of different kind of artistic things to do with astronomy. So I'm going to talk about sketching and artwork and all of that kind of thing. And normally when I go to events in person to do this, I actually do hands-on teaching people how to sketch, and obviously I've not been able to do that this year, and that makes me so sad. So the purpose of this talk is not really just me showing you pictures saying, oh look, I've done this sketch and I've made this model. It's me kind of hopefully giving you some ideas and tools of how you can try this at home. Then hopefully in the future, if we do see each other face to face at an event, we can actually do some sketching in person. So I'm just going to go through first of all the outline of what I'm going to cover tonight, and I'll try to not overrun too much, but I've tried to pack as much into this talk as possible. First of all, why did I start sketching? Well, as Julian said, I'm actually an amateur astrophotographer as well, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. When I first moved to Oxfordshire 7.5 years ago and suddenly had these lovely dark skies in an observatory, my entire astronomy life became about taking photographs, and that's amazing. But then what happened was I started processing the pictures to make the picture look nice, but I wasn't actually looking at the picture. And I went almost a year without ever looking through a telescope eyepiece or a piece of binocular, a pair of binoculars, pieces if you drop them. And it kind of made me really sad, because ever since I was 5, I've observed the night sky and just looked at it in wonder, and I'd lost that connection somehow. And as much as I adore photography, and I'm going to talk about how to sketch from photographs tonight, I think as long as you are actually studying the photographs that have been taken, it's perfectly fine. But if all you do is take a picture and then file it away, you haven't really learned anything. And I think I was kidding myself that my astronomy knowledge was growing, and it really wasn't. And I think once I started sketching, suddenly my knowledge of the lunar landscape became better, and just my understanding of pretty much everything I've ever drawn. To draw something, you have to study it really, really carefully, and you don't really have that thing with photography, I don't think, not in the same way. Your whole mentality is about getting the picture and doing all the technical stuff. And I'm not saying that astrophotography is easy, because it isn't, but it's not about the object a lot of the time. So that's what got me started with sketching. So the things I'm going to cover tonight I'm going to show you my very first sketching attempts, and they're not very good, and so it's kind of bearing my soul showing you these, but I hope by seeing them it will give you some hope that if you've had a go at this and didn't think your pictures were very good, I'll kind of show you what I did to improve them, and I'll take you through step by step of all the different things that I've done with my sketches and show you how I did it. And I'm going to talk about how to actually go about sketching from photographs, because that I think is a really good way to start when you first start sketching. First of all, you're not outside in the cold hunched over an eyepiece and trying to figure out how to do it, but it just gets the skills there of how to blend, how to do all the different steps, and then you can apply that to an eyepiece situation. So I'll talk about how you go about changing it and things you can do to practice without actually looking at a telescope. And once I've gone through that, I'm going to go through some model making. And this is another thing that I found so incredibly educational, and most of the models I've made have actually been commissioned for articles I've written for Sky at Night magazine, and I'm so glad that they've kind of tapped into this side of the things that I do, because I love making things, I love drawing, I love painting, and being able to combine all of that together is just really amazing. I'm then going to talk a little bit about some astronomy themed painting and artwork, and that section is more about doing a generic space picture rather than something that is a kind of very realistic representation of an object. And I think that's really good fun, and it's a much freer way of doing art. It can still be astronomy inspired and space inspired, but you're not kind of there thinking I must absolutely accurately reproduce this thing. So it's a lot freer, really liberating. Actually, as somebody that's a control freak, you never quite know what you're going to get out of it with some of the techniques I use. So I'll talk you through some of that as well, and a little bit of kind of textile painting that I've done, and other miscellaneous things. There's hardly anything in my house that hasn't had some form of astronomy makeover, and so I'll go through that, and also some astronomy inspired jewelry. I do make jewelry as well, and I like to draw on ideas that I've got from astronomy things. So to start off with, in 2014, this is when I realised that I hadn't really been looking at things properly. And at that time, Jupiter was very prominent. And I just thought I only was using my, I've got a really old kind of 102mm refractor. It's just a Helios refractor, so it's not an apochromatic one. It's not a fancy telescope at all, but it's still my favourite visual telescope. I really like the field of view with it. It's very lightweight, and I just love that telescope. It was given to me by a dear family member, and it's sentimental, and I just love it. And I just looked through the eyepiece, and I wanted to mostly, rather than capturing features of Jupiter, which you can't see very much of with just a basic eyepiece on a telescope that size, but what you can see is the Galilean moons. And I wanted to just, every clear night, try and get out there, just sketch out the positions of the moon relative to it, the moons relative to Jupiter. And when I was doing this, I was amazed that Galileo was able to figure out which was which, because without Stellarium telling me, I still would not have a clue which of the Galilean moons was which if I looked at it through an eyepiece. All you can see with this telescope is basically two cloud belts, and then just in those little areas of seeing when it settles down a little bit, you could just get a hint of something else there as well. That's all. But the ever-changing shape of the Galileans was really interesting to me. Now, Jupiter isn't even particularly round on these pictures. Nothing is particularly accurate. So what I did to improve that was make some observation sheets. Now, you can download sketching sheets online. I like to make everything myself. It's just one of the things I like to do. And obviously, sometimes the Galileans are all on one side or the other, sometimes they're evenly spread. So I made a few kind of observation sheets with a circle already drawn on them, just A4 pages, so I could fold them up and put them in my observing diary. And I had the circle for Jupiter in different positions on the page, so I could select the one that was appropriate for the positions of the moons. And by having this circle a little bit bigger, it makes the sketch more accurate. And as I go through all of this tonight, anything that you want to have a go at, please think big, because when you try and draw something really scrunched up on a tiny piece of paper, it it's just really difficult. And the bigger you work, the easier it is. So if I forget to say that when I'm showing you the pastel sketching section, please just fill the page, whatever size page you have, because you'll find it easier. The downside of having a circle this size on an A4 page, however, was that the positions of the Galilean moons was then to scale very inaccurate. And one thing I will say about pretty much every sketch I've ever done, at a glance it might look like a photograph, but in reality they're not always that accurate, and that's fine. You know, I still think I've got a lot to learn myself when it comes to this. But what you can get here is the relative positions of all the moons, and that was the important bit. But by having that circle pre-drawn and a bit bigger, it was actually really good, even if the scale wasn't quite right. I then moved on to doing some sun sketches, and I don't know if any of you guys have a hydrogen alpha solar telescope. We've got a Coronado PST, so it's just one of the really small ones. Trying to take a good photograph through that telescope with a digital SLR is really difficult, and I think it took me 6 years of pretty much imaging every clear day before I got anything I was remotely happy with through that scope. Now I've got an ASI, ZWO ASI 120 camera. Life is so much easier, but with a digital SLR it's really hard, and that's all I had at that time. It was International Sun Day in 2014, and I could see lots of nice prominences and filaments and plages on the sun, and I wanted to capture that. Every picture I took was atrocious because it was really, really hazy. So I just thought, do you know what, I'm going to draw it. And I'm so glad I did, because with that telescope, I genuinely find it's easier to capture what I'm seeing with pencils or pastels than with a photograph. First of all, with the hydrogen alpha telescopes, you can tune the etalon to look at slightly different wavelengths, and at one end of the range, as it were, the prominences are more visible and the plages are more visible. At other parts of the range, the surface features become more visible, and in a photograph you have to pick one or the other, or go somewhere in the middle, so you don't get a particularly good version of either. Certainly with the scope that we have anyway. It's quite old now as well, which doesn't help, and the focuser on it's atrocious. But I just found that doing this with pencils was a really good way of doing it, and I got a little bit better. And these surface bits here are just a pencil on its side and just kind of randomly scribbling. I wasn't trying to get absolutely every millimeter of the picture to be an exact representation of the surface. And this is a technique that I use with all of my sketches. If there's an area of certain texture, I don't try and get absolutely every dot identical, as long as you're alluding to the fact that this is a smooth bit of the lunar surface or the solar feature, or this is a particularly textured bit. You can actually allude to that in a really simple way, and I'm going to break that down when we get to the pastel sketching section. So I did get a little bit better at this, and of course with pencil, the white bits are what you have to leave behind, so you kind of have to mark those out first, which is what I did, and the filaments and then the prominences was great. Now, I wasn't in love with this. I was happy with the amount of detail I was capturing. It was quicker and easier than imaging through that scope, that's for sure. But one thing I did really love was doing solar and white light sunspots with pencil, and I still prefer to draw those with pencil now, even though I mostly work in pastels for everything else. And that's mostly because the center of a sunspot is dark, and then you've got the grayer area around the outside. And particularly my first solar filter was just a Barda piece of solar film, which made everything grey anyway. So it just worked really, really well. So I carried on practicing with that, and I was trying to capture the same features on the same day in both lights with pen and pencil. And I was also practicing from photographs to get a little bit more detail in the sunspots as well. This was a really nice sunspot region, and this was actually a photograph we took with our 8-inch Richard Crescent with a solar filter on the front. And then I stacked 90 images, and any of you that do imaging will know that when you stack a picture you get way more detail. So it's really nice to actually sketch from photographs, not just with the sun but with the moon and deep sky objects, because you see so much more in a stacked image. It's not to say that I don't still love eyepiece sketches, because I do, but I think there's just something slightly different about doing it from a photograph. So I practiced, and I was really loving the pencil for these, but I just wasn't loving the hydrogen alpha. And it was a chance email exchange with somebody about an entirely different subject. where they mentioned that they too sketched solar stuff, and they did it on black paper. Now I have a full set of coloured pastel pencils already, because I say I dabble in lots of different art, and I thought, why did I not think of this? Because being able to capture the just looking through those hydrogen alpha telescopes is gorgeous, and it just hadn't occurred to me to try and capture it in colour. So this was my first attempt, and it looks like a little cat paw print in the middle there. So I still had a way to go in terms of figuring out how the pastels were going to work for me, but I suddenly was like, yes, this is what I want to do. So I just carried on practicing again, sometimes from photographs, sometimes at the eyepiece. And if I'm working at the eyepiece, because I have spine problems, I can't stay hunched over an eyepiece for hours on end. These sketches really don't take that long, the ones that I do at the eyepiece, but the whole of the surface, I wait till I've got inside. So I'll do the filaments and the plages and prominences, any kind of interesting features, then I fill the rest of the disc in when I get inside and I'm sat on a more comfortable chair, and that works brilliantly. So just kept practicing that really with a mixture of my own photographs. I think these pictures were actually Pete Williamson's photographs. Most of you know Pete, and so I've sketched some of his stuff as well. I also wanted to capture this. In 2017, my husband and I went to the USA to see the solar eclipse, and this was our honeymoon. We got married in 2016, but we waited to have our honeymoon to have it in Glendo State Park to see the eclipse. I didn't do this at the time because we had 4 digital SLRs, 2 bridge cameras, 6 mobile phone cameras, and we were trying to capture every single aspect of the eclipse, and it was our first one as well. So halfway through I stopped all the imaging and just basically looked, because I really wanted to make sure I didn't just live the entire first eclipse through a camera lens. When I got home and I'd spent hours stacking the images and getting a result that I liked, I just wanted to capture this, and I'm really glad I did. And when I shared this picture online, somebody emailed me and said, have you seen this sketch by Mary Proctor? And one of the talks I do is all about the history of women in astronomy, and I know that a lot of women in the 1800s and 1900s were solar astronomers. A lot of them went around eclipse chasing, and Mary Proctor was somebody I'd never heard of, even though I've kind of researched quite widely on this subject. And there are so many striking similarities between these two images, and it kind of made me feel proud, I guess, in a way, but just I'm on the right path here. I hope that these historic women in astronomy would be proud of what I'm doing with my pencils now, because obviously I have the technology to never do this, and I was glad that I did. So I can't remember who sent me this picture now, but I'm really grateful that they did. Moving on to the moon. This was my first attempt at lunar sketching, and it looks perfect. And the reason for that is because I traced it. So I completely cheated. And this was a photograph of the moon that my husband had taken, like one of his first pictures years ago, and it was just on the wall, pinned up on a notice board. So I stuck it on a light box and just kind of tried to trace it. Very clinical. Didn't really like the result necessarily. I mean, it's okay, but it's just not what I was wanting to achieve. But I did have a go at doing this with pastels on the black paper. And for the same reason I was talking about earlier, I like the black paper because particularly night sky objects, the background is black. And actually, when you're looking at the sun, the background is as well, because everything's filtered out. And having a black page without having to worry about colouring in a whole page and just leaving some white bits, I find it easier working that way round. I've got a brain that doesn't cope well with inverting things or flipping things around, so trying to think back to front kind of makes my brain hurt a little bit. So this was the first time I attempted a pastel drawing of the moon, and it was one of my own pictures, and I took the picture in March 2016 and I sketched it in July 2016. So this is like one of the mountain regions, and this is crater Archimedes up here to just give you your bearings. I spent 6 hours on this sketch, and no, I'm never 100% happy with any of my sketches, but for a first go with pastels, I was quite pleased. Within minutes of me putting this online, someone had asked if I'd just taken a photograph and put a Photoshop filter on it. And I was a little bit narked, if I'm honest, because I put a lot of work into this. But one of the things that I did, one of the things I love about being able to sketch from photographs is you can have it on your laptop screen. When you want to get some fine detail, you can actually zoom in on the picture. And what I did for this is zoomed in on the picture to try and get some detail here, then forgot to zoom out again. So if you was to actually overlay this sketch with a photograph that I sketched it from, you would realize that they are so inaccurate compared to each other, it's not true. So this is a pretty bad sketch from an accuracy point of view, but it's still one that's on the wall because it was my first go. So that's a tip. If you are doing stuff on a laptop screen, remember to zoom back out again when you plan out the rest of your picture, because half of this is at one zoom and half's at another. This is a picture of crater Endymion by Pete Lawrence, and I had another go at doing a kind of big area rather than a high res area of just one crater. Really enjoyed doing this as well. Took quite a long time. Actually made a point of taking photographs as I went along to prove to everybody that I had in fact drawn this and not just used a Photoshop filter. I don't have a problem with people putting a pastel drawing filter on a picture, but when you get accused of doing it when you haven't, it's really annoying. So I'm going to go through the materials that I use and talk you through the basic steps that I follow when I'm doing a pastel sketch of the moon, so that it hopefully will give you some ideas of how to get going. The first black pad I ever bought was this Frisk brand. I'd never heard of them before. It was just what they had on Amazon. And I've always stuck with that because it's very smooth paper. And when you're working with pastels and you're doing a lot of blending, it's really nice to have a page that's got a good slip to it. If you use conventional pastel paper, it's got a lot of texture on it, which is nice for certain things. But for astronomy stuff, I didn't find it that good to work with. So any black paper or card that you have will certainly do, but if you are going to buy some black paper from scratch, I really enjoy this one myself. You may find that you prefer something else, but this is just what I use. The first set of pastel pencils that I'd ever had was the Stabilo Carbothello brand, and within about a month the black and white were down here, while the rest of them, the colours for the H alpha pictures are worn down a fair bit, but the rest of them are still full size. So I now buy black, white and lamp black, which you can just see on this picture has got a slight blue undertone to it, and I'll talk about when I use that in a minute. You can buy these singly, but also for a slightly cheaper price you can actually buy packs of just white or just black pastel or charcoal pencils, and I've certainly used the cheaper ones in sketching workshops and they work really well, but I've just kind of stuck with this brand for my own sketching because I really like the way that they blend. If you are going to use pastel pencils, the big advantage you have is that you can sharpen them and get a lot of precision with the point of the pencil, as long as you don't press on too hard. Now, because they're very crumbly, you can't sharpen them with a standard HB pencil, so you have to buy one of these old-fashioned kind of school rotating handle pencil sharpeners. They're not that expensive. I just get those off Amazon as well. If you don't have these, but you do have ordinary pastel sticks, the chalk style pastel sticks, just have a go with them, because in the sketching workshops, a lot of people that do the drawing with me prefer to use the sticks, and they do amazing jobs. So have a go. You don't have to go out and buy a pencil specifically to do this. And if you're working on a big page and you're filling the A4 page, the corner of a pastel stick will be enough to get the precision anyway. But I just really like these. I can hold them better and stuff like that. So in its most basic form, I'm just going to show the simplicity here with this little sketch that I recorded. I first lay down a very thin layer of white, and obviously I don't do it this fast, this is a sped up video, blend it, and then if you look at most of my sketches, the small craters are literally a black dot with a little white edge on one side and a grey edge on the other. And these little craterlets are so important when you're doing a sketch, because the more of those you have around the outside of whatever feature you're drawing, the more it's kind of selling the idea that this is a three-dimensional drawing. And as long as you make sure that the highlight of the crater, the bit that's illuminated by sunlight, is the same in all of them. It isn't on this one. As I said, my sketches are never as accurate as people think they are. But as long as generally the shadows are pointing the same way, the highlights are pointing the same way, these very simple shapes will overall make up a really nice picture. You can add a central peak, and you can see that a dot and a triangle, and you've got something that looks like a feature casting a shadow. And you can just kind of go around the outside of it. So this isn't an actual crater. This is just me showing you on paper how easy it is to sell the idea of a three-dimensional thing. Now, any one of these little bits on their own might not tell much of a story, but when you throw all of them together, suddenly you've got something that is looking like a three-dimensional sketch. And I always try, when I'm looking at a photograph or even at the eyepiece, try and see it with an abstract eye, break it down, look at the really white bits first or the really dark bits first, whichever you prefer. Once you've kind of sketched out the vague outline of whatever it is, just colour in all the really dark crater shadows, all the really bright white bits, then everything else that you fill in is just adding flavour. There are no real shades of grey here, but if you wanted to make this sketch way more accurate, you're just kind of filling other features in shades of grey between the two. And it's amazing what a difference it can make. This was done tiny as well. You could see this was just literally a dot with a pencil, but if you did that bigger, it's actually even easier. So just looking at, this was a sketch that I did of a photograph of the Plato region that was done by Dave Eagle, and he kindly let me draw it. Always choose photographs that are taken with a low sun angle, because you get the really harsh crater shadows then. Doing this sketch, all I did was broke it down into small chunks, and all I'm doing here is filling out the white bits, the black bits, and then all the bits in between. And you can see that some of this bit, this is a line and a black line, that there's nothing else more complex to it than that. These, when you look at each thing on their own, are really basic shapes. There's a triangle with a long triangle, and these areas around the edge here, Plato does have a kind of slumped terrace here. I don't have every single bit of the slump terrace on the sketches, and at a glance, when I show you some of the other pictures that I've done, it might look like there are, but if you actually break them down and look at them carefully, you'll see they're all just made up of simple shapes, all of them. And these shapes are amazing. It can tell us so much about the morphology of the crater, because we know that there are high bits here and low bits here because of the shadows, and we can learn loads of it from that. These bits around here where you've just got like a hint of shadow and light, what I tend to do there, cotton buds that I've used for blending, just use the cotton bud with a bit of blended pastel on it, and you can just very lightly run it around an area. And all I've done here is just add a few mottled bits with my cotton bud. There's this very slight hint of white here and a bit of dark there, and instantly this looks like a raised up area, and this is a lower lying region. These hints of shadows here make that whole area look like they're lower than the surrounding regions, and all that is a bit of cotton bud and just kind of sketching around with it. So just don't be overwhelmed when you look at a picture like this, because I know when you first look at a photograph, you can think, oh my goodness, where do I start? But if you just lay down that grey first, if you're doing something near the lunar terminator, make sure you've got the vague line of where the shadow and light boundary is, and then just break it down into small chunks. And if you need to just step away from it for a while and come back, please do that, because I can't think of a single time I've done a sketch where I haven't wanted to throw it in the bin halfway through. And generally, if you go and walk away for 5 minutes, come back and look at it from a different angle, you'll see it in a different way. Take a photograph of it and look at it on your phone, and suddenly you'll see it with a different eye, and you'll realize that whatever you've done is really good. And you can keep it more simple than this, but every little feature around the outside that you add here will just sell this whole idea that the sun is shining from this side and all the shadows are pointing that way. And it's honestly really therapeutic to do, because you can be very methodical with it, but just don't stress about getting absolutely every speck right. I mentioned before about texture. There's just me randomly scribbling around here, and it makes it look like a kind of rough textured surface, and it works. These are just a few of the other pictures that I've done here. This is Aristarchus and Herodotus region that I did from a photo by Grant Blair. And this was a photograph of Arzacle taken by Craig Howman. And this is what I was talking about earlier. There are slump terraces on Arzacle. It's a really fun crater to actually photograph. If any of you want these photographs that I've sketched from, just email me and I'll send them to you. I've got them on Dropbox for people to use to practice from, and the people that took the picture have given permission for that. But there are just a few regions where I've kind of just made sure that those little highlighted bits were accurate. In here, it's just a few random scribbles, but it alludes to the idea of this layers of slumping down that area. This bit here, this is a fun crater to do because you've got a complex kind of slump area. You've got a lovely central peak region, but then there are also lots of craterlets on the inside as well. And just building all of that together just makes the whole sketch work really well, and it just looks like it could be a photograph. And all of these sketches are approached in exactly the same way. This one here is the Ptolemaius Trio, one of my favourite regions of the moon, and this is one of my favourite sketches to date. I did this on A4 paper and I submitted it. It's a photograph taken with the National Schools Observatory's Liverpool telescope. I submitted it beginning of last year into their monthly photo competition, and I won, and the prize for that was getting it blown up on a big square canvas. And seeing it on the wall really big is just giving me the urge to actually paint on canvas some really big lunar landscapes. I haven't had time to do it yet, but what I have done is bought some A3 paper so that I can work a little bit bigger. Harder to photograph and show afterwards, but and also storage gets a bit of a problem when they're not A4, but no, just go for it. It's worth it. Really good fun. And this is crater Archimedes, which you're going to see quite a lot of tonight because I made a model of it as well, which I'll talk about later. So all of these areas, again, just alluding to the general idea that there are slump terraces. Pay attention to the shape of the crater shadows because that's what gives it the accuracy in terms of the actual morphology. The rest of it is really just a breakdown of very simple shapes. One thing that's really good fun to capture with sketching kind of transient features or clair obscure effects like the lunar X. I love the lunar X. I know there are many more clair obscure effects, but lunar X is just my favorite. But if you look at the lunar terminator over the space of an hour or two, it's actually changing quite rapidly. So this was two pictures that were taken a couple of hours apart, and you can see that in this one the lunar X is very prominent, but on this side the X has all but vanished, which is why this feature is only visible for about 4 hours a month. Once the terminator moves over it, it's really hard to actually see the X shape. It's great that there's a craterlet on the wall of the X as well, which I wouldn't have been able to see if I'd done this at the eyepiece. So this was from photographs. But also what's changed as well is that all this crater that was all in shadow apart from the high bits of the side of it, suddenly you're seeing central peaks and crater shadows, and the terminator is just so fascinating to look at over a period of time. If you've got a clear night in the winter for several hours, just going out every hour and seeing how things have changed, amazing. And this is a whole other feature starting to become visible as well. So that's a really cool thing to try and capture with sketching. Great to do it with photographs, but I think with sketching it makes you really study what has changed in that time period. This is another one, Ptolemaios, but done on a waxing rather than a waning moon. And by actually measuring the length of these shadows, you can calculate the heights of the crater walls, but you can see what a stark difference there is in a 2-hour period here. These photographs were taken on a small telescope with a mobile phone by Dave Galvin. He shared them in 2017, and I asked if I could download the pictures to sketch them. Really good fun to do, and you can see how they've changed a lot as well. Now, all of those principles that I've just explained, you can apply to a full disk moon sketch. Now, if you're doing this through binoculars or telescope, you're not going to see as much detail as if you're doing it from a photograph. What I do is have a piece of paper with a circle cut out of it, because I cannot draw a circle if my life depended on it. And I just paper clip that to the page so that I get the border straight. The rest of this is just light and shadow, as I did before. And actually, most of the moon, when you've got a gibbous moon, most of the side that's illuminated, all you can really see are the dark regions and the bright regions, like the seas or the maria. And you can see those impact features from the bigger craters. But otherwise, the rest of the features are pretty much obliterated by the high light angle. But you do get more detail kind of on this section of the moon here. So we've got the Ptolemaius Trio and the Albertegnus Trio, which you're just able to see a little bit of. Over here, not that much detail, but it's exactly the same approach. Just make sure you've marked out your terminator, because you're gonna go in and make sure that that line is jagged, because there are craters and hills and mountains and pits and all sorts of stuff on the moon. So the terminator is not straight, but just colour all of the rest of it in grey, mark out where the dark maria regions are, mark out where the highlight regions are, then just take your time doing it section by section and just filling it in. And this is a really neat idea. One of the things that I've been doing a lot in the last couple of years is drawing the moon as it looked on a date that is special to somebody in my life. So I did it for our first anniversary. I drew what the moon looked like on our wedding day as a gift for my husband. I've done it for 50th birthdays or 10th birthdays or whatever, the moon on the day you were born, or the moon on your 21st birthday, or both in one sketch. It's a really unique gift to give somebody, and you've got time to do one now before Christmas, because you can post it in an A4 page with a large letter, really easy to send, and it's such a truly unique gift. And these my family love them. Nearly everyone's got one now, and it's just really a nice thing to do. So I finally, after many years of sketching, managed to get the phases I needed to complete my moon phase diagram. And I was so delighted when the BAA asked if they could put this in the journal for the December issue. This is obviously done with different years. It's been done over about a 3-year period, these sketches. And basically the libration is different for all of these, so it's obviously not in the same lunar cycle, but you could find pictures online and do this and do the whole moon phase diagram. But if you look at all of these actually quite closely, you'll see that there isn't a massive amount of detail in most of the sketch, but the sketch makes it look like it's more detailed than it is, because you've got the shadows correct and the crater lines correct and stuff like that. Again, if you was to overlay this onto a photograph, it wouldn't be terribly accurate, but this is art and it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. Now, I mentioned before that I use lamp black as well as ordinary black, and the reason that I use that, first of all, I ordered it by mistake initially, and then I realized I could use it because I love doing earthshine sketches. If the date that is special that I want to draw a moon picture of is a time when there's a slim crescent, there's not a lot of detail on a crescent moon, whether it's a waxing or waning. So the sketch is a bit kind of, it just doesn't look very good. So what I do instead is just colour all of the highlighted region in and then just do earthshine. And I use a full moon photograph to get the detail on the earthshine section correct. But what I do before I do my white, I just put a very thin layer of lamp black down, and that gives it this bluish undertone, because the earthshine on the moon does always look very blue, certainly in all of my photographs, and it just makes it look so pretty. And exactly the same thing, but less detail here, because obviously on an earthshine moon you don't see an awful lot of detail. You probably don't even see as much detail as I've got on here, to be honest, so you could keep it even more simple than this. So it's a really nice technique. Now I just wanted to show, as I go through here, I wanted to show the results from the sketching workshop that I did at Solar Sphere in 2019. I've done 3 or 4 years of sketching workshops for Solar Sphere now. Most of the people that sat down at the table to do these workshops had not done astronomy sketching before. One of the things that really strikes me about this collage, there are some pictures of Ars Ackel, some of them are of Archimedes and some of them are of Plato, but each of these sketches that is of the same crater, it's really obvious which crater it is. You can see that these 4 pictures, these 5 pictures in fact, are all of the same crater, but they all look very different from each other. And each of those sketches actually looked like the photograph, but they all look different from each other's, and that is perfect. I don't ever want to stamp my exact drawing style onto anybody else. Everybody's handwriting is different and everybody's drawing style is different, so it's really important, although you can take inspiration from other sketching artists out there, don't worry if your sketch doesn't look identical to the ones I'm showing you tonight, because you really don't want it to. You want it to look like your sketch, not a kind of recreation of somebody else's. All of these sketches are fantastic in their own right. These were done people aged 4 to 80, just amazing. This sketch here I love. It was done very simplistically, but you can see the depth, you can see the crater shadow, you can see the bits around the outside. So even something as simple as that works. So if you're finding it overwhelming getting all of this other detail in, just start out by keeping it simple and it still will look really good. I'm going to talk about some deep sky sketching now. This was the Pleiades, my favourite astronomy object. I absolutely love it. And this was a sketch that I did using my trusty Helios refractor. And I just did this on white paper with an HB pencil. And mostly because I didn't want to colour in an entire page of white paper and leave some white dots in there. One of the things you can do is scan this or photograph it and then invert the image so you have a black background with white stars on it. And that is something that I definitely do. And one of the things that I do when I'm doing a sketch like this is to mark out the brighter stars. So with the Pleiades, obviously we recognize the diamond, and I've never been able to see 7 stars with the naked eye. Through a telescope, there are a lot of stars in this cluster. So start off with the really bright ones that you're familiar with. Use your pencil as a bit of a guide. If you're looking at your field of view and you can see the Pleiades, for example, is filling 3/4 of it, just mark out just very briefly where it's going to fit on your page. Then use your pencil as a way of measuring the distance between the stars and just get it roughly right. And once you've got those stars in place, you can then think about getting all the other stars in. And I find it really hard to focus on one region at an eyepiece. My eye is darting around all over the place, especially if it's a telescope that isn't tracking and you've got to keep nudging the knobs to get the thing to move and keep it in view. But once you've got the bright stars marked out, it doesn't matter if you have to keep messing around and getting it lined up again, because you'll have your bearings. Now, I did this sketch, I won an amazing pair of binoculars in a raffle at the beginning of this year, I think it was. And they're the biggest binoculars I've ever had. And the M42, the Orion Nebula, looks absolutely stunning through those binoculars. So I wanted to sketch it. So I did this on white paper. Any future sketches that I do with those binoculars or an eyepiece that is deep sky, I think I'm going to do on black paper. If you struggle to get precision with the pastels, you can buy kind of gel pens that are white and grey. You can use those instead. But for blending, I did use a 2 or 3B pencil for this, because the kind of softer the pencil, the more easily blendable they are. But I still find pencil harder to blend out than pastels. So I really wish I'd done this with pastels, and it's something I will do over the winter when we get a clear night and I have time to do it. But I scanned this and inverted it and just did a little bit of tweaking to get the contrast right. And then straight away, it's then looking like what I was seeing through the binoculars. So that's a really great thing to do. Obviously, we had Comet Neowise over the summer. What a thing that was to cheer us all up during lockdown 1.0. And so my binoculars are 15 by 20, so the comet pretty much filled the field of view. What I've now started doing, when you're sketching at an eyepiece, what you're seeing is an ocular view, so the field of view is circular. A piece of paper is not circular. And one of the things I struggled with was laying things out in the right place, because I was trying to make a circle fit onto a square. So now I have pre-made observing sheets, and I just draw round a plate so that I've got a circular field of view. It makes life so much easier. Then you can think about this as a clock face. So the comet, I made sure was pretty much bang in the middle of the field of view, but think about where the brighter stars are. You can mark out roughly where the comet was, but then fitting the other stars in, just think of it as a clock face. So this was about 1 o'clock. That star was kind of just to the lower of the middle region, and just work your way around the clock. And that makes it so much easier. And this is another sketch I really wish I'd done with pastels, because this comet was so beautiful and it was just lovely and smeared by this point. Once we got to July, the tail was more diffuse, and I think I'd have done a better job of it with pastels. But once I inverted the picture, I tend to desaturate it completely so it's black and white, invert it, and then just do a little bit of tweaking. Don't be afraid of digital manipulation of your pictures when you've done a sketch. It's as valid a thing to do as doing processing on a photograph that you've taken, because when you scan something, it's going to be overexposed and whatever. If you've got some blobs where you don't want them, you can clone them out, you can denoise it, and you can make the sketch look really nice. As long as you haven't changed it so much you can't tell what the object is or do any actual scientific analysis of it, then I think it's perfectly legitimate to do that. And when we get to some of the other art sections, I'm going to show you some things that I've done with digital manipulation that are very simple to do. So yeah, you can do absolutely anything at the eyepiece. This sketch, however, was done with Stellarium, and this was me wanting to test what it was like using pastel pencils to mark stars on black paper. I didn't do this at the eyepiece. I used Stellarium, and with Stellarium, if you go into the ocular view, it shows you what it will look like through whatever binoculars or telescope you choose. So it gives you a circular field of view, and it's really, really useful to practice doing that with Stellarium before you go out and try and do it at the eyepiece. Because as I said, trying to work on a rectangle with a rectangular photograph is a lot more easily replicated than trying to get a circle onto a square piece of paper. So use the ocular view as a practice thing. And this is the leaping minnow and splash asterism within Aurora, something that I've still not had time to go out and actually sketch for real at the eyepiece, but really good fun to do that. This was a colour sketch that I did from a photograph for a greetings card, and this is the kind of thing you can do when you start sketching like this. I used oil pastels for this and I hated them. Oil pastels are very waxy, really, really hard to blend. And you also can't really layer them up very well on top of each other. But this is some lesser known planetary nebula that I can't even remember the actual magnitude of this. It's very, very faint. And this was like a Hubble palette narrowband picture of it. But I made this quite small, and it was a greetings card. It was a very unique, one-of-a-kind greetings card. Anything signed MLS, by the way. I used to be Mary Spicer. I haven't stolen someone else's pictures. I used to sign everything MLS, but obviously I got married and changed my name. Now, one of the things that I do at Solar Sphere is Horsehead Nebula sketching, and this is using data that was shot with the Forks telescope, the 2-meter telescope. So if we had a 2-meter telescope in the garden, this is what the Horsehead Nebula would look like. And the photographs that I used for that workshop are in monochrome. And I sat down and actually did a sketch of this last year in monochrome. But obviously, when you take a photograph of this, the Horsehead Nebula is red. Rather than do the sketch again with a red pastel, I've just opened it up in Fastone Image Viewer, and using the hue slider in the color thing, is just one slider. You can completely change the color of something, but without making the black background go away. And it's something that I've utilized a lot particularly with the astronomy art section. So don't be afraid of doing this. I think it's fine to change the color of something. We do it with photographs all the time. We'll take a color photograph and make it mono. We'll shoot with a mono camera with color filters. Playing around with the color is just a fact of life when you're doing astrophotography. So I think it's perfectly okay to do this, and you can make it whatever color you like. because if you're shooting through a narrowband camera particularly, the colour is false anyway. Now, I hadn't corrected, when I had these printed, I hadn't actually corrected them for the flipping that the mirror telescope did. So the sketching workshop, all the Horsehead nebulas are pointing the wrong way, and somebody pulled me up for my sketch being the wrong way around, so I also flipped it in fast stone to stop people moaning at me. But again, all of these sketches are so very much like the photograph of the Horsehead Nebula that I gave them, but each of them is completely individual, and I really love that. My favourite one actually was a child here drew an entire horse there, which I just thought was adorable. I absolutely love that picture. All of these could be a photograph of the Horsehead Nebula because they're all just so brilliant, yet every one of them is different from all the others, and that's exactly what I'm looking for when I do a sketching workshop. Deep sky sketching from photographs is amazing. I love deep sky sketching at the eyepiece, but even with a decent telescope, most deep sky objects are just grey smudges. And while that's still great fun to do, and it's really nice to practice doing it and laying out the shape of it that you can see, seeing how the shape changes with different eyepieces is all great fun, but you can't see a lot of detail. And I like just art in general and astronomy art, so I wanted to do a sketch from a photograph. And again, this is Fawkes telescope data. This was the Whirlpool galaxy from a photograph that I printed. And incidentally, if you have the ability to do it, if you are working from a physical photograph rather than the laptop screen, try and get it printed out almost the same size as the page that you're working on, because if particularly when you're beginning to do this from like scratch, if you're copying something that's roughly the same size onto a page the same size, then it makes life a lot easier than thinking about scaling things up. So that definitely improves the performance of people that have never done this before. But this sketch, when I first did it, I hated it, and I was really upset because I'd wanted to have a go at this, and I put it away. Following day came out and looked at it and thought, oh, actually it's okay. You will be your own worst critic when you look at this. Now again, all I've done here is the kind of laying down some grey, blending it all in, and then going in, marking out the white regions of the star areas on the spiral arms, adding a bit of colour, a little bit of darkness, alluding to some of the sort of detail that's in here. And if you look at any one part of this sketch, it's not actually that detailed, but the overall effect is actually really pretty. And these are, we did the Fireworks Galaxy and the Whirlpool Galaxy in the sketching workshop. I adore every one of these pictures. They're all so beautiful, yet all so different from each other. And again, age range was huge here, and you know, the children did such amazing work. So please do have a go at this. I have all of these photographs on Dropbox if you want to download them and have a go at drawing them. I'm going to move away from sketching and talk about model making. Now, as I said, most of what I've done so far has been commissions for Sky at Night magazine, but it's definitely something I want to do more of. First of all, Crater Archimedes. Now, this was the sketch that I was talking about. Now, before I'd been asked to do this for Sky at Night, I'd had a go at making this model out of plaster of Paris, and it was very, very heavy. Very breakable. If it got dropped, it was very crumbly, and then it all went moldy when it had been in a bag for a couple of weeks, so that went in the bin. I had another go using you know, the bandages, the not Mod Podge, I've forgotten what it's called now, you know, like the plaster of Paris soaked bandages, just dipping them in water and building that up. That also went moldy. So then I decided to have another go at it, and I used liquid latex, and this is liquid latex version 2. So I feel like I know this crater very, very well because I've sketched it 3 times now. I've made 4 models of it now. What I wanted to do with this model, although we have no information from this picture other than the shapes of the shadows, so the model itself will not be to scale in terms of the height relative to the diameter, but that doesn't matter because the purpose of this model, certainly for outreach purposes, is to demonstrate crater sunrises and sunsets and showing how the sun angle massively changes the way that crater shadows look. And you can do this just with a torch in this liquid latex model. So the way that I I did this was using liquid latex mixed with a little bit of flour, can be any kind of flour. And if you just mix it to the kind of right proportions, what you're looking for is something that's a thick paste that is kind of moldable. So you don't want it too wet, but you don't want it too stiff either, otherwise it ends up quite lumpy. And then first of all, what I did is just poured some liquid latex, a shallow layer, into this old Tupperware dish, left it in the airing cupboard overnight to fully cure. So then I just had a rubber base, and then I just kind of sketched out the overall shape and then just started building it. And I time-lapsed this as well. So just marked out with a Sharpie the rough sort of area of it. Then I was just basically dumping down blobs of it, and then to mold this you dip either a spoon or a pencil or your fingers into some clean liquid latex so it doesn't just stick to your skin, and then you can kind of wet it down and just shape it and mold it. And then periodically I would just shine my phone torch onto it to see if the shadow shapes were correct. So all I was looking for here was making a shape that would as closely as possible mimic the shadow shapes that I was seeing on the photograph and the sketch that I did of this crater. So it took a little while, and I kind of mixed up the liquid latex in batches. And when it had fully dried, it looked something like this, and then I spray painted it. Now at a glance at the moment it doesn't look like it's showing very much, but when you then start shining, I use sunlight here and move the crater because obviously I can't mimic an entire sunrise and sunset because that takes a month. But basically as the sun gets higher, the crater shadows get shorter. When the moon is fully illuminated from above, all the features essentially get wiped out by the light, and then as the sun angle lowers again, those shadows start to elongate again. And the crater sunrise takes place over several hours, but then the sunset again will be when the moon is waning. So that may even be 3 weeks after the sunrise happens, depends where exactly the crater is. And although, as I said, this model in terms of its height diameter ratio is completely wrong, it totally represents a crater sunrise and sunset. Because it's really lightweight and rubbery, there's no health and safety issue with it getting dropped. Children can pick it up and handle it if you do outreach, and it's fine. And yes, I know you can 3D print craters, that there's countless things online you can download and print them, but 3D printing a crater doesn't teach you anything about the morphology of it. I thought I knew the crater quite well by sketching it so many times. It was nothing on how well I know this crater now from making a model of it, because you're really studying every little bit that is making that shape of the shadow. I would like to do this again because there are things I'd like to do differently, but I really think I need to move on to another crater if I'm going to make another model of that. Now this is asteroid Eros, and I wanted to make an asteroid model using basic household materials that were easy to come by. The brief for this article was to write about making a model using easy to come by materials, and then it was published during the first lockdown when flour was a really scarce commodity. But I did this with salt dough, and this is my model of it. So salt dough is a bit of a nightmare to work with because it's quite heavy, and I wanted my model to be quite big, but it's very, very simple to make. It's kind of roughly equal quantities salt and flour, and then you just add water to it and knead it until it forms a dough essentially. And all I used for this was a pen, a pencil, and a Sharpie, just to use that as my modeling tools. You don't need fancy modeling tools at all. You can just use a sharpened pencil because it's just dough and it will take the imprint. When I did this, I actually did it in 2 halves. So first of all, I just kneaded the dough. You're not looking to develop gluten or anything here. You can use absolutely any kind of flour, and you just knead it so it's smooth and kind of pliable. So I did that first of all, and then I kind of essentially cut the asteroid in half lengthways. For my reference photographs for this, I downloaded the Near Shoemaker data is freely available from the NASA archive, and that was a probe that took a load of high-res pictures of it as it did a flyby. But also on their NASA YouTube channel, there is actually a three-dimensional simulation that has been built from those images. So it shows the asteroid kind of rotating. So I just basically took screenshots at every angle of that video so that I had actual reference photographs to work from. I cut it in half down the middle and basically just made the very rough potato. It actually looks a bit like a clog, an old-fashioned wooden clog, and then just tried to use a pencil and the kind of blunt end of a Sharpie to just kind of mark out those little areas. These bits here are just little bits of dough that I crumbled into crumbs, because if you remember the picture I just showed you, the seismic activity on this asteroid basically shook a lot of the craters loose, so it's covered in gravel essentially. And by having to study this again, I found myself learning so much about this asteroid that I wouldn't have known otherwise. I then baked it, and it had to bake for 25 hours because this was quite big and salt dough holds the moisture. So if you wanted to not do that, you could make it a bit smaller. You can actually bake salt dough in the microwave, just do it in kind of 10-20 second bursts. It would have taken a long time, probably used more energy than just having the oven on, but it's a very, very low temperature, very slowly dehydrating it in the oven. Then I kind of carved it out and stuck it together and just painted it grey. Asteroids have a very low albedo, and they only look the way they do when the lighting angle is correct. And the asteroid was imaged under different lighting angles during that mission. So what I then did was using a light source to try and mimic those angles from the asteroid. So the actual near shoemaker images from NASA are on the left on all of these pictures. The ones on the right are my version of it. So at a glance, it didn't look that much like the actual asteroid, but when you mimic the lighting conditions that those pictures were taken under, then you suddenly have something that looks like the original. This is a fantastic thing to do with children because it's really safe materials. Nothing smells horrible like liquid latex does. It's dead easy to do. And then if you like making videos, you could then photograph this at all the angles and recreate the video that's on the NASA channel. So it's a really, really good thing. I'd like to do this again using a slightly different method, but for a first go at making an asteroid, it turned out quite well. I have just recently worked on a Comet model, but because that article hasn't published yet, I can't show you that, but I will be sharing that on my social media in January. It'll be in February issue of Sky at Night magazine, I think. So once that's published, I will share that. Another thing that I've made is another thing that's really good for outreach. And this was inspired by our trip to America. We went to the Science Museum in Denver. One of the features they had there was the 7 stars of the Plow hanging from the ceiling. And it only looked like the Plow from one spot in the room. The stars were actually kind of to scale at different distances from each other, and basically as you walked around it, it changed completely. So I mimicked that model by just using painted bamboo skewers and white polystyrene balls, and this is actually to scale. So if you look at this from the side, this is to scale. So if you're stood about ½ a meter in front of this box, this is probably an bigger than A4 size box, I would say. And I've actually measured this so that it's accurate. So the side to side distances we can't do much about because it will only ever look like the Plow from Earth. But in terms of distances front to back, this is accurate and to scale, measured it all out. And this is really good for outreach because it demonstrates the fact that constellations and asterisms generally have no relation to each other in real space. They're just a line of sight effect. Some of these are quite near each other, but we're talking a distance here of like 100 light years, I think it is. So even though these look close together, they're still about 10 light years apart. So they really are nowhere near each other in space. So that was a really fun project to do as well. And something else, you can put it on I've bought a turntable for all the exhibitions I was going to do, and obviously haven't done any of those this year, but I have this on a turntable and you can see that it only looks like the Plow when it comes around a certain direction. Really, really great fun to do. Now I'm going to move away from the stuff that is, well, there's one picture that's kind of like an accurate representation of something, but this is more the astronomy inspired section. I just checked the time. I think I'm overrunning, so I'm just going to quickly zoom through this bit. This was my first acrylic painting of the Crab Nebula. There are lots of things I do differently for this, but again, this was a unique gift for somebody. I wanted to paint it. Most of what I do now is with acrylic pouring, and this is such a fun technique. Many of you may have seen it on YouTube. It's a really fun thing to just go down a wormhole and watch when you can't sleep at night. You basically mix acrylic paint with some kind of pouring medium and a bit of water so that you got a nice texture. And then you just pour it onto the canvas, tilt it around, and then you end up with this random pattern. And if you use colours that are synonymous with galaxy pictures and then chuck a few stars on it, sorted, you've got pictures. So these were just the paint poured in different colors in layers. Turn the cup upside down, let it sit there for a minute, lift it up, and then you get all of this amazing effects happening. Really, really good fun to do. Also, if you add silicone into it, it causes the paint to start separating out and you get this lacing effect as well. None of these look like nebulae pictures until you put stars on, and you can pretty much do any random assortment of patterns. And when you put a black background on it and some stars, suddenly it looks like a nebula. Now, this was a picture that was inspired by a calendar picture that we had using a Hubble palette. This is not a color palette I generally am comfortable with. I really loved how it came out. But one of the things I did was photograph that and then use that hue slider to completely change the color palette of it. I also added star spikes as well, because I'm a bit of a sucker for star spikes, especially on art, because it really adds to the idea that this is space. So even if you've done this in one color, you can totally change how it looks. This picture was a slightly different technique. It's a cup with the bottom cut off. You put a load of black paint down, sit the cup inside it, and then you pour your colors inside the cup. So the colors have to go down and underneath. The idea was to create a kind of picture that looked like a galaxy. What I got looked nothing like a galaxy, but when you change the color of it, it looks like a storm system on Jupiter. And this is a technique I want to do more of, because I wouldn't have thought of using this technique to make a Jupiter picture, but monochrome in particular, it really looks like Jupiter. And all I've done here is play around with the hue slider and desaturation sliders, nothing fancy. I also have dabbled a little bit using Brusho powder pigments. I normally do paintings like this with it, but I made this butterfly picture and I wondered what it'd look like if I inverted it. And suddenly I was like, oh, this looks like a butterfly on a nebula background. So what I did is just started having a go. Now you have to do this in reverse and then invert the image afterwards. But you basically sprinkle the powder all over the page in a random pattern, and less is definitely more, because this stuff is super, super pigmented. And once you've sprinkled all of that across the page, just use a little bit of water and just spray water onto it. And because this is really concentrated powder pigment, make sure you're using watercolor paper, by the way, otherwise it'll all kind of get very, very wrinkly. But this just looks amazing. You spray it with water, and then over time the colors start to blend out into each other. So if you put too much on, you get a really big mess. So this is one that had already dried. I then use a cocktail stick and a toothbrush to sort of spray stars around, put dabs of bigger stars, smaller stars, try to keep it random, make sure when you spray clusters that they're kind of not an even distribution. And then what you get at the end is something that looks like this, but when you invert that, it looks like this. And it's a little bit kind of different texture from what you would normally see. But then when you add star spikes onto this and start playing around with the color, the possibilities are absolutely endless. So this is a really fun medium to work with. Don't get it on your clothes because it's a nightmare. But no, it's a really good fun thing to do. Now, this is what happens if you use too much paint. It basically, all the middle goes very grey and a little bit washed out. And I also learned quite early on that I'm not very good at painting star spikes, but that gives you the idea. And this is another one as well. So you only need a few colors here, because you can change the color digitally afterwards. So that's really great fun. I'm going to whiz through this bit because I know I've talked for ages already. On textiles, the same kind of thing. If you just use a bunch of colors that have become synonymous with galaxy paintings and then put stars on it, you've got something that looks like a nebula. Everyone calls it galaxy when it's actually nebula, and it really irks me. For this, I just wanted to make this kind of punch hole pattern to make it a little bit more unique. This one was just a rough painting of a galaxy, but there's so many things you can do, and you can do this on black bags as well. You can buy black tote bags and just paint onto them rather than doing the shatter pattern. I've done this on shoes. I've used exactly the same technique on jeans, and none of this looks remotely space-like until you put the stars on, and I'd swear you could put stars on anything and pass it off as a nebula. I've done it on t-shirts, I've done it on tissue boxes. I've even used spray paint to give my mobility scooter panels a bit of a pimp. So I just sprayed them black using just blue, just spraying it a little bit here and there, very, very little paint used. If you hold the nozzle down a tiny bit, it causes the paint to spatter. So you've already got your stars on there. And then add a few more stars and bingo, you've got a space themed mobility scooter. Absolutely awesome. The temptation to paint the entire scooter like this now is strong. I'm having to resist because I'm not sure it's a good idea, but I really want to do it. Slightly different than the textiles and nebula stuff, I really like celestial artwork. Like, I know that it tends to be synonymous with astrology, but I just love this kind of 1990s style celestial stuff that thankfully is back in fashion, because I've had it on my wall since the 1990s. It's never been taken down. But I did this with pyrography. So these are just wooden coasters, and I use pyrography tool to burn the design into it. So it's kind of vaguely astronomy themed, but not really an actual object. I've done cross stitches with this. I had a go at mosaicing. Gosh, that was hard work. And by the time you filed all the bits down, you have no skin on your fingers for 6 months, but it was good fun. So finally, some astronomy inspired jewelry that I've done. I like to recycle. I play bass guitar, and I obviously have lots of friends who are guitarists in my band, and I always save their guitar strings and I make jewelry with them. And I realized that when you kind of fold round 2 or 3 layers of this, they kind of look like orbit diagrams, and I think they're really interesting. So I kind of think you can put planets or stars on these, put colored things on them, and they kind of have a vague, the person that buys this probably doesn't even know it's necessarily astronomy themed, but I look at these and I just see orbit diagrams or orreries and stuff like that. And these look really good, and you can do 4 layers or more. You can just keep going with different layers and then wire wrap the ends and solder them, and they look amazing. I really love them. The other thing I do is hand paint pendants, and generally I do kind of abstract designs or dragon eye painting, and some of these will have like 10 layers of painting on them, mostly done by scratching and blending with a scalpel or a pointed tool. But I realized that this technique could be applied to sunspots, so I had a go and I made this. Now I'm going to say what everyone's thinking. When it's symmetrical, it kind of looks a bit like a cat's bum, so if I do these in future, I'm going to make sure the sunspot is not perfectly spherical or perfectly central, and I will make it look a little bit more like a sunspot and less like something else. But the whole technique is there, and it's something that can be applied. Abstract designs again, nebula colors with stars on first, painted onto the back of glass cabochons. Beautiful, just gives you an astronomy inspired kind of abstract pendant, which is all unique. And with acrylic pouring that I showed you before, when you tilt the canvas, loads of paint runs off. So I always have parchment paper down and let those acrylic skins fully dry for a few days. Then you can cut them up and stick them onto the glass or just directly into these trays. And what you then end up with is something that looks kind of spacey as well. So I don't waste anything. All of the skins get saved and reused. I'm going to finish off just with one of my proudest moments, really, when I made this. When I was a child, we had this encyclopedia sold by a door-to-door salesman. In it was this ice cave painting. A lot of the space art at the end of this book was so inspiring to me as a child. It captivated me of what other worlds might look like. And I just happened across a technique online that meant I could recreate something that was inspired by this. This is really good fun. All you need is quite fluid paint. Actually, my paint was a bit thick here. Paint the whole canvas black first. And then I've got the paint mixed again with pouring medium. I tend to use Floetrol and a lot of water, so the paint's very fluid. And then you just pour stuff around wherever you want the feature to be. And I made my own sort of pale blue shade. I've used white, black, and a bit of silver. When you mix metallic paints in with this and with the Floetrol as well, you get this kind of lacing effect, and it forms these really beautiful effects. So you dump all of this paint down in a random way, and then you get the hairdryer on it and you just kind of blow it around the canvas. So you can see I was having a bit of trouble here because my paint wasn't quite fluid enough, but you kind of do that to get the vague shape of it, and then go in with your mouth or a straw and just basically go in and correct any little bits that you're not happy with. Because at the moment it's got like a hard edge. So I kind of went round and added little bits. The great thing about this is if there's a bit you don't like, you can just pour some black paint on it and blow it off the end again and correct it. But what you had at the end was something that looked like this, which is very reminiscent of some kind of an ice cave. And then with a brush, I went in and painted this bit in. And I was just so proud of this picture. Again, I've kind of ruined the star spikes a little bit, but this was my first attempt at this technique, and I can see so much potential for doing lava worlds. And I actually I did have a go at doing the same thing but using red and gold. It did work, but I think I need to do this again using some yellow and orange and red rather than gold, because the gold didn't quite work. But my thought process here was like maybe an early Mars that was full of lava. I put far too much paint on, so I had to go in with some black and blow some back off this way again. This is so fluid, you can play around with this forever. And what I ended up with at the end of that was this painting. And this to me is asking for me to paint a Lord of the Rings Balrog onto it. It looks more fantasy than what I was actually going for, but this technique can be used so easily to create so many different effects. So I'll finish there. I hope you enjoyed that, and I really do hope that you have a go at some of the techniques that I've shown you tonight. And if you do have a go and you're struggling, please email me, and if you have a go, send me your pictures. I'd love to see what you're up to. So I will stop my screen share. And sorry, I did overrun a little bit there, but obviously I'm around for questions, and I will stay here for the social if anyone has questions to ask then.
Wow, well, thank you very much for that, Mary. That was just amazing, as always. All quite inspired by it, I think. Do we have any questions, or are people going to come over to the
just reading through the comments that have come through on YouTube. What do I use to protect the pastel pictures? Great question. I kind of forgot to mention that. The downside of pastels is that they dull very easily and they get smudged very easily. So when it's finished, I photograph it. It goes into a document wallet, then into an A4 folder, and then it stays there. It never leaves the house. I get them out very infrequently. What I then do is get photographs, prints of the photographs or the scans, so that I have a folder that comes with me to talks or exhibitions where people can flick through my sketches, but they're prints of the originals. And I've had some really bad experiences with fixatives where the nozzle's been clogged and you end up with loads of blobs all over the painting, which just completely ruins it. And I've had the same thing happen with hairsprays and fixatives. So now I just don't use anything. So I keep it in a wallet and I never take it out of that wallet once it's done. And I know that over time they'll dull, but you know, pastels do that. It's just the downside of it, but I love working with them so much that I'm just happy to accept that my record of it is a print of the pastel rather than the original. What's my cat called? Yeah, the cat that you saw tonight is Evie, but we have 4 of them, and you know, usually 2 of them appear, but there's only been 1 tonight. Which object would I recommend starting with? To begin with, some of the pastel sketches that I've done of the creators like Archimedes, the ones that I've got on my Dropbox, which I guess I can make available to you guys to circulate. They're really good because they're high res craters, so you're taking a picture of just one crater. They've got very well defined shadows. I've chosen them carefully to work with basically sketching workshops, so they're really good ones to just kind of have on your laptop screen and have a go with. So I will email the Dropbox link to you guys so that you can circulate them. There's another question came in there. Have I done much sketching of planets from photographs? I haven't, but it's absolutely on my list of things to do. And I would probably use a very similar method where I mark out the light and shade regions and see where I go from there. With the planets, you can add colour though, because I think the planets look really good in colour. And I've seen some incredible Mars sketches this season while Mars has been obviously dominating our skies. And I've photographed it, but I haven't had a chance to sketch it yet. So that's something I want to do. But I would definitely do the same thing, marking out the shapes in light and shade and then adding the colour and the little flurries. With planets, just make sure you do it big, because those little intricate features on Jupiter and Mars, for example, will be really hard to do if you're doing your sketch the size of a, well, I don't know, like this glass, for example. So yeah, just basically do it big and just the same approach. Aurora, have I ever attempted an Aurora? I haven't, and it's on my list of things to do. I'd love to do an Aurora picture in pastels because I love the way they blend, but I also really want to have a go at adapting the fluid acrylic art to do an Aurora inspired painting as well. I sometimes struggle with the inspired stuff because if I'm taking some inspiration from a photograph, I tend to want to recreate it absolutely perfectly. And for art, it's okay to not do that. So I'm still kind of finding my feet with not being quite so surgical about my art. But Aurora is high on my list of things to do when I get time, definitely. Yeah, I love Aurora. It's just amazing.
Just to say, if you want to join the Zoom meeting, we tried to post the link, but YouTube seems to have blocked it. But the details are there on the screen. If you just go to Zoom with the meeting ID 8279296 and the password.
Now I've finished, I can pour myself a Bailey's ready for the social.
That would be good, yes. I should have organised one before I came here. But...
yeah, I thought ahead. I said to Mark, it's not often I get all my stuff together for a talk and it includes a bottle of Bailey's. So it's quite a novelty for me.
Very good plan. I did prime one of the children to bring me a mince pie, but that doesn't seem to have happened either. So. Something will be along. Right, I think we're going to wrap up the YouTube feed.